Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Joe, and I'll be your host for tonight's live stream. Tonight is the second live stream of a series of events and articles we're running about Sheffield's radical past and thinking about how we can bounce forward after the COVID-19 pandemic. Tonight's episode is all about democracy and voting rights. Sheffield was central to the struggle for universal suffrage, but there is still much more to be done to enfranchise citizens here and across the globe. How has the role of an active citizen changed in our city? What can we learn from the way things are done in other places? And where are we headed in the years to come? Today's live stream will look at the similarities in the past and present struggles for democracy and look at how the people of Sheffield have fought and continue to fight to create a fairer and more equitable society. We've got three speakers on tonight's live show, which are Minesh, Parekh, and Joshua Forstenzer and Ruth, Hubbard. And I'm just going to begin with our first speaker and invite Minesh to join us. Welcome, Minesh, if you could turn on your video. Great. It's lovely for you to join us tonight, Minesh. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm doing well, thank you.
So, Minesh, you were recently commissioned to write a brand new article on Now Then, which is visible on the Now Then website, nowthenmagazine.com, looking at the history of democracy and voting rights in Sheffield. I just wondered if you could maybe just begin by giving me just a sort of a very brief kind of outline of, summary of that article and how you found writing it.
Yeah, of course. I guess what I really wanted to do in the piece is talk about democracy. I think we often, in the UK at least, reduce democracy to just being about, voting or the structures and how we vote and political representatives. And I think democracy is something much broader than that. It's something we, build with other people. It's something that's ongoing. And Cornel West speaks of like a democratic experiment. It's how can we facilitate society in a way, and how can we facilitate everyone's collective flourishing? And I think there's a lot of that in Sheffield's history, and I describe in the article from the Chartists to the suffrage movement, but which were like struggles for democratic rights, for voting rights, but also wider movements calling for democratic public ownership of resources, utilities, but also protections for green space. There's a whole long history of people trying to protect and preserve and build better, which I think is particular for Sheffield as well as a universal phenomenon too.
Absolutely. And Sheffield has this history of a place of democratic campaigning, and I think it's often sort of, well, perhaps at least in my circles anyway, describes itself as a fairly radical city, and it's been often referred to as kind of the People's Republic of South Yorkshire. Do you think Sheffield's history means that Sheffield as a place kind of deserves that kind of moniker and that association of being a radical place?
Yeah, I think it does. I think there are two facets to the People's Republic of South Yorkshire description. There's the council and then there's the people as well. For the second, certainly I think the people are deserving of the title of campaigners or radicals. I think, as I wrote in the piece, Sheffield has been a focal point for democratic agitation from the Chartists, where Samuel Holbury and others planned a Sheffield rising to formed a militia to try to storm the town hall, all the way through to the suffrage movement, where, as well as having the first petitions for women's suffrage, Adela Pankhurst set up as a suffragette organizer in Sheffield for the pivotal years of that campaign. This is the city that gave birth to the idea of, at least in the UK, gave birth to the idea of green belts and national parks, had the first national park within our borders, part of it. And it has a long continuous history of campaigning and organising. Like, there's a reason, for example, that Sheffield was one of the few cities Malcolm X visited when he came to the city, or when he came to the UK. And then on the other hand, like, there is the council, and I think certainly historically there is also a history of radicalism there. I wrote in my piece about Sheffield being the first ever Labour-controlled city, or Labour-controlled council in the country in 26, and that council was elected on and enacted a wide range of reforms, including mass house building, like creating work for the unemployed at trade union pay, like introducing electricity to workers' houses and electric street lighting. I think something we often forget in modern history is how that transition was from the 1800s to the 20th century. And I think it's fair to say that that early Labour government forced a lot of changes through to get rid of squalor and slum housing and build new good quality housing, increase pay. But this also came off the back of radical councils pre the formation of the Labour Party. I wrote in the piece, like, the liberal councils of the late 1800s moved to collectivise industries, take over water, electricity, and fought the great monopolies. And beyond this, is we're maybe all too familiar with the Sheffield skyline to think about it too much, but the Labour administrations of the 50s and 60s were celebrated internationally and nationally for great public housing works at Park Hill, at Gleedless. These are all really, radical reforms, radical changes, which, are befitting of the title of either the People's Republic of South Yorkshire or the Socialist Republic of South Yorkshire. I think, these were radical councils which drew on radical ideas of the time. I think if you look, for example, on Sheffield Archive, something I found when writing the article was there's a photo of then council leader David Blunkett speaking alongside Stuart Hall at a Marx memorial panel in Sheffield City Hall. It's something which is maybe entirely unfathomable now with political discourse in the country, but that was a centre of the road Labour Council in the 80s was organising on these issues. I think that's a very radical thing to have in our history, both of the people and of the council.
There's really, for me, when I was reading the article, there was that sort of great quote that you mentioned from George III, referring to Sheffield as a damned bad place because of this history of radicalism, and it kind of triggered for me a memory of some of the writing that George Orwell famously wrote about Sheffield in his book Road to Wigan Pier. And I started reading it and I found this sort of specific sort of quote in it that I thought actually speaks a bit, to this topic and to your article as well. He talks about this is a quote from George Orwell, where he's talking about sort of the perspectives of differences between North and South. Anyway, it starts with this. It says, "The Northerner has grit. He is grim, dour, plucky, warm-hearted, and democratic. The Southerner is snobbish, effeminate, and lazy. That, at any rate, is the theory. Hence, the Southerner goes north, at any rate for the first time, with the vague inferiority complex of a civilized man venturing among savages, while the Yorkshireman, like the Scotchman, comes to London in the spirit of a barbarian out for loot." And I think, apart from that, almost that north-south divide there that I think a lot of people would still very much recognise today, I thought it was really interesting that George Orwell has included that, almost that description of democratic there in that kind of sort of stereotyped portrayal of the Northerner. And I just kind of wondered whether, that's obviously it's almost a characteristic that's as inbuilt perhaps to kind of Sheffield as a place as it is with sort of other potential sort of, stereotypes of northernness, as it were. And I just thought that was really interesting, and I just thought if that was something perhaps you'd recognised through the article as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an interesting characterization, isn't it? It's a democratic that really chimes with the idea of a shocked Londoner, for example, saying people will talk to you on the bus up there. That kind of it's a democratic as an affable. It's kind of like democratic meaning the commons, or like as a commoner. It's a democracy as a character trait rather than like so going beyond democracy as structures or democracy as representatives. It is really a democracy as a people and how people act and treat each other. Yeah, I think it chimes a lot with some of the things I included in the piece of like democracy being building projects to look after each other, whether that's like Ruskin's commune or obviously trade unions, as well as great democratic projects where people looked after each other both at work but also material outside of work as well. It's that kind of democracy as a feeling, but as a like practice to other people as well. It's democracy as our responsibility to others.
And what obviously there are other cities in the UK that also lay claim to this sort of radical sort of city roots, especially like Bristol, for example. But what do you think it is potentially that that you might lay at the reasoning behind this sort of radical history in Sheffield? Obviously, perhaps is it in its industrial roots? Is it just purely in its culture? Is there something in the water or even in the beer in Sheffield that makes people a little bit more radical?
So I think there's definitely something in the confluence of like industrialization and inequality, and I think obviously one led to the other. Development led to an increase in inequity, but also gave the city a population boom, which increased people's power and capacity to do something about that as well. I think especially recently in the UK, there's this trend of seeing cities broadly as like places full of cosmopolitan, liberal-minded people contrasted to the countryside, and like we see that a lot in Red Wall discourse, but actually it's a confluence of a large number of people plus a shared sense of justice equals an increased capacity for change making. I'm not going to go out on a limb and say Sheffield is unique in that, because like obviously we have Manchester example and Rochdale in the history of the co-ops. There is movements all across industrial centres, particularly for like movements for justice. So maybe Sheffield isn't unique, but I would say it does can lay claim to a whole host of births. As I wrote in the article, it was a first for some of the, checkpoints on the way to women's suffrage. It was a first for protections for green spaces. And I think maybe there's something in that is unique about Sheffield, in that we're not very good at communicating our history. There's a lot of firsts that are quite unknown, even at the level of, I don't think we have plaques or any kind of civil infrastructure compared to a lot of other cities, whereas Manchester and Bristol might be able to better shout about what they do. In Sheffield, that's left to like independent organizations, and that goes beyond history as well. Like if you look at, for example, in Cardiff, what they've done with Doctor Who compared to, we have a whole series here and you wouldn't barely know it if you walked around. I think maybe there's something in Sheffield's people feel like and have always pushed like that narrative that we are a radical city because no one else is doing it for us, whereas there is, other cities have like paid historians or anything else to push the narrative of their city. We have to do it ourselves here.
Right, and just finally moving from sort of the history a bit more to the present day, Minesh, because obviously you've been involved in a new project in Sheffield that is specifically looking at encouraging democratic engagement, specifically in the local elections, obviously, that are happening very shortly on the 6th of May, and the project's called Who Is My Councillor? I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that project.
Yeah, so I will say my involvement has been like in an advisory capacity, because I think, but the reason I was really keen to help in any way I could was because I think, I see democracy as something that we build and something that we have to work on. And I think there is a real lack of democratic infrastructure, both online and offline, in Sheffield and nationally for local governments and national governments, where, often it's really hard, if not impossible, to find out who is standing for election in a local area, what they think about, how to ask them a question. And I think Who Is My Councillor is a really important project in that sense, because it creates a way for local people to find out who is standing in elections, what they care about, what their views are, see what shared principles they may have, see what opposing views they may have, and make informed decisions about the people they want to run their city. And in Sheffield, it's a campaigning city. There are lots of campaigns ongoing at the moment. It's Our City, where we're going to hear from Ruth later, but Acorn have released a set of local demands. There are calls for councils to enact local Green New Deals, calls to take action on air quality. People really want to know what their councillors would, and prospective councillors would do on those issues. And I think having any better democratic infrastructure is great. And I think this is a really cool project working on that.
Great. Thanks so much, Minesh. So we'll come back to you at the end of this live stream when we bring everyone back for sort of a brief panel discussion and to answer any Q&As at the end. But yeah, thank you so much. It was great to chat. And if you do want to read Minesh's article, please do check it out on nowthenmagazine.com. It's a great read and is a really great way of finding out about all of sort of Sheffield's radical past. So thanks very much, Minesh. Great, thank you. Now I'd like to introduce our next guest. So Joshua, I was wondering if you could turn your video on and join us. Hi Joshua, how are you doing?
Hi there, I'm doing great. Thank you very much, Joe. How are you doing?
Yeah, very good, thank you. Very good. It's great to have you joining us. Your background is you're an academic from the University of Sheffield, and you've done a lot of work looking at democracy. And I thought a good place to start is really talking about just democracy as a way of life.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm a philosopher by training, and the main academic I've worked on for most of my life is a guy called John Dewey, who was an American philosopher who largely wrote from the end of the 19th century throughout the first half of the 20th century. And he was kind of a quintessential American liberal progressive voice on the hope that democracy could be the answer to the world's problems. He's got some really nice phrases, that one of which is that democracy is a way of life, not just a set of institutions. So in fact, Minesh earlier was saying some really interesting things about how one of the things we see in the quote that you mentioned in Orwell is something about that kind of personal characteristic of being democratic. And Dewey was very expansive in talking about the fact that that has to be the purpose of an education system and the purpose of our wider institutions, to foster the kinds of citizens who interact with each other in a democratic fashion. And what does that mean? Well, it means that they take each other seriously, that they respect each other across lines of enduring difference, and that they meaningfully try to solve problems together without just trying to shout each other down or trying to kind of win the day one way or another. And so for me, I've been interested in this for a long time, because I think that we, as lucky citizens, and I say that really with a sense of humility, because we very well could be less lucky. As lucky citizens of advanced democracies, we have opportunities to engage in civic life that far exceed those of many of our ancestors, and that far exceeds those of many people across the world who actually thirst for the kind of opportunities we have, and we can do so safely. Now, I work with people in countries where that's not true, in Southeast Asia, or where there are very fraught situations in relation to even so-called democracies in the region, where things we take for granted really can land you in re-education camps and far worse. So, this is something that I'm very passionate about, and I think in addition to all of this, I think thinking philosophically about our relationships with one another is a democratic thing to do. And I think in Britain, for some reason, that always shocks people. I think they don't think of thinking abstractly as being something particularly practically valuable. But certainly when you look at the kinds of conversations we have to have with each other in a democracy, they require thinking about what we think justice is, what we think fairness is. How do we think of goodness in our institutions and in our personal lives, as well as communal life. So, these are things that they're complicated questions. They require thinking about well and having good conversations with one another about. Do we thought that's what being democratic looks like?
And I think it's really fascinating. I think you look at specific sort of Britain's role historically in how democracy is sort of governed internationally. There are lots of because partly of obviously our colonial past, there are lots of other countries whose democratic institutions are slightly modelled upon our own. But we also look at comparisons, say other countries like the States, like the US, who've got such a close identity to almost the democratic systems of government. It's clearly very much rooted in what it sense is. It's very different to here. I think people are perhaps slightly less attached to the processes of democracy and than they are in other countries. And I wondered, from your perspective, how do you think that sort of differs? Perhaps I wondered if you had a perspective on that.
It's a great question. It's what I wrestle with every day, I think, as a foreigner living in this country. So I'm doubly foreign. My parents are American. I was born in the States, but I grew up in France. And so I'm really the product of two Republican cultures. There's no doubt about it, deeply attached to democratic principles and constitutionalist in spirit, really. The idea that it's really important that we have a body of fundamental laws that tell us in the end how we should resolve political disputes when we don't know how else to operate. And the fact that in Britain those things are non-codified and often, I'd say, beyond the reach of ordinary people's sense of purchase over the political processes. Of course, there are constitutional arrangements in the UK, and they play major parts of what really does go on in this country, which we saw in the proroguing debate a couple summers ago. It matters, but the sense of everyday people having access to the way in which it matters is different here. And I think there's a couple of things that I've had to come to terms with to at least make sense of it for myself as a citizen living in Sheffield, and also as an intellectual who thinks about democracy in the United Kingdom as well as in other contexts. One of those is that I think it's not an exaggeration to say that in Britain, parties, campaigns, and other organizations, including, oddly enough, and this is very odd for me from the context I come from, including the Church of England and other kind of directly relational communal organizations, play quite a major role in people's sense of what it actually means to be British and what it means to be participating in a common activity, but it doesn't typically use the language of democracy or even the language of citizenship. All of those organizations often talk about some sense of collective identity that's rooted in direct projects. So it's often about what are we going to do and how are we going to deal with something. So you've got a lot of single cause campaigns that prop up and that people get very attached to. But you also have this sense in which within wider organizations, there might be mini or micro organizations within them. So think of the Labour Party, just to take it for an example for a second. The factions matter a great deal in the Labour Party, probably a lot more, certainly than the factions in the Democratic Party. And one of the obvious reasons for that to be the case has to do with the structures of the way in which candidates get selected in the first place to be able to ultimately represent their party in a general election. Well, in the American context, factions exist and they matter and they have an effect on the way in which these things go. But ultimately, there are internal democratic processes that are translucent enough that people feel as though in the end they are kind of resolving as some kind of community of people making a direct decision on a candidate that kind of supersedes the moniker or the sub entity. And that's actually quite rare in Britain. Often the sub-entity plays a really major role because ultimately that gets elevated to some wider entity, which ultimately gets elevated, for example, in Parliament. Today, I don't know if you watched the Prime Minister's questions today, it was quite entertaining. But one of the reasons that I'm thinking about it right now is because Boris Johnson talked about this party. He was talking about the Conservative Party, right? When he was talking about his record in office, he didn't say my record, he said the record of this party. And I think that's typically British in a way to talk about democracy as though it's almost disembodied. It exists only in its institutions verbally in Britain rather than in people. And that's really the main difference. When, as a Franco-American person, we talk of democracy that exists in people. It's also institutions, but people have to bring them to life. And so we tend to talk of that very easily and comfortably. And there's almost a kind of sense of humility in Britain that we don't quite talk about it as if it inheres in people. It's more about specific projects and organizations. And I think that's the way in which I find some kind of reconciliation between what I think is really going on, which is much the same thing in Britain as in America or France. I think it's the same kind of commitments. They're just verbalized and articulated differently.
That's
did I answer your question? I'm not sure.
No, well, you did. I think you went beyond, far beyond. But that was absolutely fascinating, Joshua. No, thank you for that. And I think it feels particularly pertinent, obviously, to be having these discussions at the moment, where our press and our media are obviously very much looking at the role that money and power and how those things are influence basically the democracy that we have, and how society is governed, and how fundamentally decisions are made, and by whom and for whom, essentially. And it's a particularly pertinent question at the moment.
If I may just add one thing on that, because I think it's a fascinating thing for me to witness, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts and the other panelists' thoughts on that matter. What Boris Johnson is being accused of right now, at least through various media outlets, is tantamount to corruption. But that word doesn't appear in print. Sleaze, stinks, smell, smell analogies of various kinds or things like that. But I think that's part of the lack of that kind of firm sense of democratic constitutionalism. When you have a firm sense of your own constitution, you can say, look, this person is actually breaching a fundamental principle of what it means to be in the position they're in. Now, they may not suffer the consequences for that. We saw that with Donald Trump twice, getting acquitted by the Senate for things he definitely did. And therefore, actually, in some way officially kind of getting away with corruption. But the language of corruption was used because at least he was being accused of something that people knew was a fundamental breach of the social covenant and of the political covenant. I find that sometimes challenging as a foreigner in this country, that it doesn't get verbalized in quite the same way. I'm like, well, but that is what it amounts to. If he really did do one of the things that are being talked about right now, then he's a corrupt politician. That's what it would mean. But it's not the discourse. And I'd be really curious to understand how that feels for those who really do belong to this community and culture. Do you feel the same frustration as I do? Or does that feel normal?
Oh yeah, absolutely, Joshua. And I think maybe we'll come back to that question a little bit later on as well. But I think fundamentally, it shows that one thing that's particularly, I think, dangerous for a democracy is when politicians stop telling the truth. And then when you don't necessarily have a media that functions, that's able to call out these politicians for not telling the truth, that is a particularly dangerous and problematic situation to be in. And I think you're increasingly seeing the eroding of this trust, and then this the basic sort of tenets, often referred to as the Nolan principles in public life, these core principles that all politicians and, well, especially cabinet members are meant to be held to. And, it feels very much like in recent years, notable politicians, both sides of the pond, have shown a complete willingness to just throw a concept of truth just out the window, and just very happy to mislead both Parliament, press, and the general public at a whim. Yeah, it's frustrating, I think, is in short, to answer your question, Joshua. And I think maybe I've only got a little bit more time left before I want to move on to Ruth. But I think this concept of obviously, telling the truth in democratic participation and life is really important. And I just wanted to maybe just come on to speaking a little bit about the climate emergency and democracy, because I think this is a really, really important thing to talk about as well, because sometimes the urgency sort of presented by the climate crisis can suggest that democracy is potentially too slow, a thing to tackle it in time. And it invites important questions really about, the limits of constituted liberal democracies and, how we might be able to go beyond it with the Green New Deal and looking at things like citizens' assemblies and things like that. So I just wanted, I know that's something that you've thought a lot on and written a lot on. So I just wanted to invite any comment on that as well.
Sure. Yeah, well, thank you very much. That's a great question. It's actually something I started to think about really seriously when I worked with Majid in his term as a member of European Parliament, actually. In part because when you look at the problem of climate change, it's obviously so large and so demanding of expertise to understand the exact boundaries of the problem, what it is and what might count as actually coming close to addressing it, because a lot of things pretend to address it but don't. And so there's a widespread sense, as you said, that in a way the public can't be trusted with such decisions. What's interesting is that in a number of occasions, we start seeing that across the democratic world, the people are actually ahead of their leaders when it comes to the level of willingness to engage with radical solutions to try to address it. Now, this is particularly true when you interact with younger members of the public who foresee accurately that the climate crisis is going to be a fundamental constraint on the way in which they're going to be able to live their own lives. And so one of the things that we did some work to do is to try to articulate precisely this sense in which if we're going to tackle the climate emergency effectively, then we're going to have to understand it as a crisis of democratic culture, because it has to demand of us a much higher level of understanding of the kinds of decisions for a long time we've treated as sort of the preserve of our elected elites. And it has to basically involve citizens into deep discussions over trade-offs and over the kinds of opportunities they hope to see for their children, for themselves, and so on and so forth. And so if we're going to be able to envision what a just transition to a sustainable economic system is going to be, then we have to really gather the voices of as many of members of the public as we possibly can in intelligent ways. And that's really the fundamental constraint, is that we can't expect a straight up referendum on a number of issues to resolve what to do, because referenda on their own are not necessarily educative. And one thing that's really promising about citizens' assemblies, but also participatory budgeting activities and a number of other democratic innovations like that, is that they have this effect of teaching citizens about their own civic capacities and about how to make political decisions in a manner that really recognizes the responsibilities that we have as citizens, not just to allocate power to someone else, but to really resolve what we should do in a given context. And so, that's the hope behind that kind of work, is to develop these practices of civic learning.
Great. Thanks, Joshua. That was really interesting. Maybe we might return to some of these questions at the end, but you mentioned referendum there, which is a perfect segue into our next guest. So thank you, Joshua. Cheers. Thank you very much. So I'd like to invite our next guest to join us. So hi, Ruth. How's it going?
Hi.
Thank you for joining us tonight. And really, I'm talking to you about the referendum that is happening on the 6th of May. And you're a one of the sort of key people involved back in the It's Our City campaign. So Ruth, I've just thought, as a starting point, I'm sure, just in case some people in watching the stream aren't familiar, do you want to just give us a little bit of an outline of the campaign, really, and on what's on the referendum on the 6th?
I would love to. Thank you, Joe. That was all so interesting. And just before I do that, can I just pick up about the point about language and about talking about things? And the importance of finding ways to talk about these things in Sheffield. I mean, it was a general point I hope to make in a bit anyway, and it's this, that we are still learning to talk about governance in Sheffield. And when we as a citizens and community group first started the process of thinking about how we would create some change in Sheffield, we went to the council and we asked them, when was the last time that Sheffield as a council had talked about its own governance, about the way it ran? And councils across the country are advised to very regularly review how they run themselves, how their governance structures and systems work. And what we were told in Sheffield, no one could remember. No one could remember when Sheffield had last discussed its governance. And there was a lot of scratching of heads. And was it last decade? Was it the decade before? I mean, many councils very, very regularly do this. So this point about talking about stuff and about language, and the thing that Josh said about this strangely British way that, no one talks about corruption, for example. It is unfamiliar to us. We are unpracticed, and we are unpracticed in Sheffield. And it's really important that we try and find the words and keep talking about these things. And the other point to make about this is that in the It's Our City campaign, if you like, that it is conversations that have been so important. It is conversations between citizens across the city, across difference, that was the most fantastic part of the campaign. It was the talking to all and sundry across the city, standing in parks, in shopping centres, at every event going, to get the petition signatures we need, and talking to people about the way our council works and how they thought about it and how they experienced it. And Josh is completely right. People are often much more sophisticated in their they might not have the technical knowledge about the way the council works. I mean, who knew our council even had a constitution? Who knew? Well, many thousands know now. Not enough, but many thousands do. Who knew about the way our council works? Who thinks about it? Many do now. And it was that kind of sense of connection and communication across differences that was so fantastic as part, and a real educative part of the campaign. And what people came back and told us was all the ways they'd experienced it. But perhaps I'll come back to that. But you're absolutely right. I should explain very clearly what the referendum is about, because it is important. It's a really important vote for Sheffield. It will be binding for a minimum of 10 years. So it is really important. So the referendum that we have in Sheffield, that has been won by citizens and communities working together, is about changing the way our council works. And crucially, this includes the way decisions are made, who has the power to make them, and who has a role in making those decisions, all those council's decisions across the city. And the governance of our council, the way it works, is enshrined in its constitution. And it's important to say, this is about the way the council works. It's not about the personalities or even about the policies of different parties. It is the model of the way the council works. And it applies whoever is running our council. And who knows what position we'll be in in just over a week's time. So it applies whoever is in charge of the council. In Sheffield, we have what's called strong leader governance. And strong leader governance was imposed on all but the smallest of councils in the early 2000s by the Blair government. And actually, it's part of a project of centralisation, if you like. We live in one of the most centralised democracies in the world. And that idea that you'd have these few strong leaders in councils, which is still playing out today, was brought in and imposed on councils by that Blair government. So in Sheffield, we have 84 councillors that we all elect across our city. And what strong leader governance in Sheffield means is that 10 of those 84 councillors have the power to make almost all the decisions that the council makes. And in fact, power and the right to make those decisions is essentially vested in the strong leader, him or herself. At one point, the Constitution says, for the absence of doubt, so for the absence of doubt, that strong leader can step in and override and decide and so on, all the decisions that the council makes. So what that means is that we have 74 councillors, the vast majority of councillors from all parties, who have no formal role or legal power to contribute to almost all the decision making in our council. And the referendum choice we have is that we can maintain that status quo with power in the hands of the few, or we can move to modern committee governance, where all our elected councillors will play a role in making decisions, and where it is full council that is the overall legal sovereign body. And that, in a sense, has been the collective call from citizens and communities across Sheffield. This is what citizens and communities have made common cause about across all our differences, outside of party political agendas, to say that all citizens must be represented. We must have meaningful representation. And it becomes then something about what we always understand are basic democratic rights to representation. And I am not from Sheffield originally, I'm from Manchester. So I'm from the city of Peterloo. And Peterloo, of course, was originally a demonstration and process about the right of Manchester to have parliamentary representation. And in a sense, this is what the referendum is about in Sheffield. It is calling for basic rights of representation in council decision making for citizens and communities in all our diversity, and whoever we elect across those communities in our council. And under strong leadership, the vast majority of us have no meaningful representation in decision making. And the strong leader system leaves far too much power in the hands of one or a few people. It's not a healthy way to make decisions, as many people would argue. But that's the common call. It is for meaningful representation for all citizens of Sheffield in council decision making. And I just want to make a couple of very quick points. The referendum legally involves quite a limited and particular choice. We are empowered to choose between two models. A strong leader model, where it's one or a small group of hand-picked councillors in that kind of system of patronage that the strong leader enshrines, that they choose them. So it's a strong leader model where it's that small group who have the legal power to make almost all decisions. Or it's a model where all our elected representatives have the legal right to a role in decision making. And it's important to understand that, because we do not have the power in the referendum to decide how each of those systems works in practice, the detail of some of that. And in the discussions that follow, it is, of course, vital that people continue to have an input in in working out some of the detail of that, whatever system is chosen. But our right in the referendum is only to choose between those two models. Are we going to all be represented? That is the call from citizens and communities. Or are we going to have rule by the few? And that choice does give an opportunity to get to a better, more democratic base for our council constitution. And the council constitution is a highly technical document, a set of rules. I mean, I personally would like to see that council begin with the words, "This is the constitution of the Council of the People of Sheffield." And in all the work that citizens of communities have done together over the last 3 years, interspersed with COVID and the pandemic, unfortunately, it's going to be really important that citizens and communities stay involved. The decision, finally, to say, is binding on the council for a minimum of 10 years. Does that give you, does that clarify what that referendum choice is, Joe?
Yes, I think it absolutely does. I mean, I think it makes it very clear that, you know, the process in which decisions are made and how that would change depending on the outcome of referendum. I mean, I suppose it feels natural to really ask a question about what do you hope will be, you know, the material impact of changing decision making in this way, both on potentially, you know, people's wider democratic engagement, both in the process and also in the types of decisions that are actually being made by the council. What do you hope to be the impact of this change?
Well, at the heart, it is an issue of representation, right? It is about being citizens being represented in that decision making, and that's by no means what good democracies are all about. But it is an important element, and it's almost like a kind of foundation stone, isn't it, of our representative democracy. We either have a representative democracy or we don't. I mean, I actually think it's a scandal. I actually think it's a scandal, strong leader governance, and I think that it's the way it's been implemented in Sheffield has been particularly damaging. I mean, I think what would be hoped from a new system is that it is more open, that with all councillors playing a role, they are all playing a role in decision making. They will be accountable for that role in their decision making. We will be able to see the role they are playing for us as communities. It will have to be more cooperative. Councillors from all parties will have to work together to make decisions. And people, I think, would hope to see a reduction in that party political tribalism and an increasing efficiency. Because what happens in a strong leader system is decisions might be made, and then you've got this kind of scrabble and this kind of these terrible spectacles in full council meeting of people trying to challenge them, or decisions being called in and re-examined, and then sometimes there are U-turns later. These are incredibly inefficient ways of making decisions, actually. And I think people want to see better decisions. When you have only a few making the decisions, as often behind closed doors, actually, the level of input is so low often that you just cannot take account all the interests involved. I think, Joe, this would be a really good opportunity to show the first slide, if you can do that. And I sent you one over because, I mean, I'll just say, I mean, I think why this has arisen, particularly in Sheffield, has been, I think, because, you can go this top one, Sheffield's particular experience across the city of strong leader governance failing them, of them realising that councillors had no voice for them. I mean, the response on the streets was initially, oh, the council will never change, and you talk to them, and they'll say, what is the point of voting? if my councillor has no say? And here we have the position in Sheffield from the last local elections, for example. And that little red block there is the proportion of that's the electoral mandate that the ruling group have here. And that is where the clinging on to decision-making power is. It's that little hand-picked subset of that little red block. And if you just stand back and look at that graph, I mean, probably the thing that is most striking about that graph, apart from, oh God, all the powers in that hands of that little red block, is the extreme right, isn't it? The non-voters. And if you were in that little red block, how would you seek to govern the city? Because undoubtedly that little red block gives an opportunity for decisions to be rammed through council. Undoubtedly, that's what it gives them. But that is not necessarily what we would call good or democratic governance when we have this picture. And I think that's a really useful starting point to think about how should we govern? Because what you have to do when that's such a small block there, surely you have to work with others, you have to build your constituency, you build your coalitions, you try and find common areas to work on. And that big block of non-voters, I mean, you know, when we talk to people, when we had 20,000 conversations across the city, it is probably the biggest exercise ever, anywhere, of citizens talking to each other about, of all things, local governance. I mean, you know, it's not exactly, doesn't exactly strike excitement into one's heart, does it, when you talk about local governance? But in fact, people were hugely interested. And when you talk about democratic governance, I mean, democracy, as Joshua pointed out, is still something that inspires around the world. Yeah, you know, whether it's Spain or whether it's Hong Kong or whatever. And so you have to ask these big questions. How should we govern? And that's at the heart of this referendum. And a system which cuts out so many people has got to be bad. And I think there is a real sense of possibility about the kinds of changes that could be made, but open, transparent, inclusive. These are, you know, systems, the systems that we put in place, that we try and put in place for people's kind of well-being or flourishing. They're also about how we live across all our differences and our inequalities in Sheffield. There are lots of things people can do in governance terms to address issues of inequality. And this is the kind of thing that people talk to us across Sheffield. And what is undoubtedly true is that things like voice, fairness, participation, an ability of people to have sense of control in their local area and over their lives, these things are as important to people as their basic needs. They're absolutely as important. And you know, whatever.
Thank you, Ruth. I'm going to bring, that was really fascinating and a really great chat. I'm just going to bring our other panelists back for the last sort of 10-minute
Can
section.
I say one more thing, Joe? Can I say one more thing? The
Quickly,
biggest challenge for a community campaign has been reaching people across the city. We are, you know, we have a network across Sheffield and groups in Burngreave and Mosborough and all that kind of stuff across the city. But, you know, we're at heart, we're a tiny unfunded community group. And the biggest challenge has, despite the 20,000 conversations we've had, and despite all the fantastic ideas, and it's all there to be seen on our website, and we hope people engage with it. The biggest challenge has been reaching people and informing people. And, you know, anyone out there who can do stuff to inform people, it's still, you know, it's still important that we get the message out. This is about change. It's about local democracy, and it's about people having a voice, and all of us living together across our differences and the best systems we can put in place.
Great. Thank you, Ruth. I agree. It's an absolutely vitally important conversation to have started, and yeah, it's great work that It's Our City have been doing. I'm going to bring our panel back in, and maybe I'll start with Minesh here. Which is just a really open-ended question, really. I suppose is just, we've heard about some of the perhaps failings of our democratic systems, as well as potentially a little bit about where they've come from. Obviously, a lot of these are hard-won, not privileges. That's the wrong word. These are hard-won rights that the people have won from the divine rights of kings. Really looking back at history, and I have to ask a fundamental question: is do we live in a functioning democracy?
I mean, it's an important question. I think it depends how. I don't want to go down into it depends on how we're defining things, but we can compare to history where, like as Josh said, we have more of a say and more autonomy as a collective than people do in other nations. People have in this country historically. We have more freedom in that sense. But I mean, you do have to ask, how much do our democratic structures enable collective flourishing? We live in a country which, inequality is rife and has gotten worse for the past 40 years. We live in a country where, where Grenfell can happen and no one gets charged. We live in a country where, 100,000 people can die from either or be killed through cuts to benefits or through the failure to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. With little accountability, I think, I always see protests both as calling for democratic accountability, but also an act of democratic accountability themselves. The things we have to respond to as activists, the things we have to call for, that is us that is a call for accountability where we don't have any route to power or route to change. The fact that we have to do that, the fact that these things can happen and nothing seemingly changes, would suggest, I would say, that is a failure of our democracy, that we have crisis after crisis after crisis. So, and very little in the way of ways to change that. I'm wary of saying maybe it's more that the democratic experiment we're on in corner westwards is failing, and maybe it's better than it has been in the past, maybe it's worse than it has been in some regards, but we have to work to build it regardless. At all stages, it is a process that needs working on. At the moment, it needs a lot of work, locally and nationally.
Great, thanks, Minesh. Joshua, I know it's a big old question, but if you can try and keep a fairly concise answer, that'd be much appreciated. What do you reckon, Joshua?
Well, I'm going to do the depends on how you define. Look, I mean, there's an obvious sense in which, sure, we live in a democracy insofar as the people have a right at regular intervals to select the leaders. Now, the sense that's interesting that I think that comes up from your question is that maybe that's not enough, right? Maybe that's not really very democratic, particularly if, let's say, the remit from which you get to choose those leaders is actually fairly limited and narrowed by other features of the situation.
I mean, maybe to narrow the question a little bit, that there is one question that's coming from Sam, is the sense that, do we need more we need more participatory, sorry, I always say this word wrong. It's something about it that just, I can't quite, participatory.
It's your Englishness, I think. It stops you from saying it,
I just can't do it. It's too many P's and T's. Something wrong with that word for me. I just can't do it.
We do need more participatory features of a democracy. I mean, referenda are one way of doing it. And for what it's worth, when the campaigns that engage in referenda in the way in which Ruth has described the current campaign in Sheffield, that's fantastic. When people are led into conversations, are encouraged to think of themselves as genuine civic agents of change, multiplying those opportunities is going to be essential for having anything akin to rule by the people. You know, if your goal when you define democracy is to say it is actually a mode of government where it is actually ruled by the people, then you're going to have a lot of people having a lot of those conversations in a lot of different contexts and having multiple avenues for having those effects. Another question Sam raised in the chat, which I think is a really interesting question, is you know, how much does civil disobedience matter, or how much do we need movements that kind of exceed the standard bounds of democratic law? And for what it's worth, I have to say immensely. So there's overwhelming evidence that the most powerful movements across the world have been those that engage in civic disobedience, and that they're actually highly effective. Political scientists have really engaged in high-level study of various forms of movements, and that those that engage in carefully orchestrated civil disobedience tend to basically succeed in their objectives more greatly than those who refuse to do so. One thing that's interesting is that Sam, I think, also asked the question of political violence in there. That's actually, according to the data I've seen, much more complicated. When civil disobedience veers into violence, there can be phenomena of backlash that lead to undesirable effects. Unsurprisingly, you might think, in terms of if your goal is to get public opinion on your side, overt violence might not be so helpful in doing so. I do think one of the things that's really interesting in the British context is that often it's those two are run together as if civil disobedience and violence are one and the same. In a lot of other political cultures, they're really obviously separated for a number of reasons, because even though civil disobedience may involve breaking the law, may involve even low-level destructions of property and so on and so forth, it's understood in a lot of those contexts that this is kind of fair game. Sometimes you need that in order for your society to have a chance to reform itself and to give to those who systematically have less power within the normal bounds of politics a chance to actually mobilize people around their causes of concern. I don't know if those answer the questions, but those are my thoughts.
Yes, absolutely. Ruth, did you have a response to those kind of conversations? What do you think?
Well, at a local level, the call from Exeter City and citizens and communities across Sheffield is for meaningful representation and for more participation. And those are absolutely two key tenets of a democracy, whatever way you look at it, right? And we developed out of the conversations that we had with people what we call community principles for democratic governance. And they're there to be engaged with. Unfortunately, the council didn't really engage with them. And actually, those conversations are still to be had, and we still tout them around because they are so important and they come out of such a massive exercise. But you see, I would be more pessimistic than both Minesh and Josh. I actually think we're in quite a dangerous situation. Yes, we live in the advanced, advanced democracies, as Josh called them, of the West and the rich West. But all the international indicators, I'm talking of Ruth as Ruth now, not It's Our City, by the way. All the international indicators show there are problems, even at the top end of advanced democracies. And I think democracy is not an endpoint. It will always be an ongoing struggle as new contexts arise, as new challenges arise. I mean, democracy in terms of the climate emergency, in terms of coming out of COVID, it's going to be massively important, in terms of how that is a part of the picture going forward. I actually think we're in a dangerous situation around democracy. And there's a philosopher called Jacques Rancière who says there is no emancipatory institution. And that gives a kind of indication that things will always be an ongoing struggle. And he also talks about ideas. He says actually democracy and politics is actually very rare. Things are pretty much the status quo all the time. He actually calls them the police. And he says movements for democracy are always interventions in the name of equality, in the name of equality. And then there are other people, like other big political theorists, like someone called Hannah Arendt, who wrote a fantastic book called The Origins of Totalitarianism, that still has so much purchase today in terms of thinking of the situations we kind of live through. And I'm talking from my old life now. I'm retired now, but you can tell I used to be a bit of a teacher. So there are, one of the issues I felt about Sheffield moving here is that, yeah, we have this pride in Sheffield and we have this sense of fairness and people talk to each other, and we're the largest village in England, and we have that kind of sense of community, and it's all there. But and I think partly this is a problem with the council. We are actually quite insular. We need to look, I think, much more outside. And I think the way, for example, our council has gone, we are 20 years behind sometimes in our thinking, for example, around participation. We haven't had any in Sheffield in any organised way, you know, at all via our council. Yes, people are doing it themselves, and that's arguably one of the best ways of doing it. But we are behind, and we do need to look outwards. And I think some of that is really important going forward, and especially, I mean, you know, I look at organisations called the European Civic Forum, who keep a watching brief on people's right to protest, people's civic space, and their ability to organise across Europe and wider Europe. And, you know, you see problems arising. So I'm more pessimistic about the bigger picture, and democracy is always going to have to be something we struggle for, and we must. And citizens and communities at a local level are one of the most important ways we can fight for democracy.
Absolutely, Ruth. And I think it's probably the moment where I segue a little bit from trying to be a kind of objective host into sort of a little bit more subjectivity myself, in the sense that, you know, looking forward to you know, new structures or systems that we need in order to raise up people's voices and views. And I think both thinking about this both locally and nationally, and, you know, as an organisation, Opus Independence and Now Then magazine, who I work for, you know, the project I'm working on at the moment is the Festival of Debate. So we're launching sort of South Yorkshire-wide you know, exercise in democratic engagement and active citizenship, creating a platform for communities to come together to discuss the key social, economic and political issues of the day that's launching with next week. You know, and Now the magazine in itself, you know, running streams like this, running articles, again, it is another platform for that. And I guess this is maybe just, you know, ending on this really, going around the panel again, is just, you know, what new structures or systems do we need to continue to raise up people's sort of views and voices, and, you know, what potential other successful approaches from other places in the world could we potentially use in Sheffield. And yeah, if I could ask you to try and keep responses fairly concise, that would be lovely. Minesh, we'll start again with you there.
Try and be quite quick. Yeah, I mean, the thing I thought of actually with Josh and Ruth, there is a question of, obviously we need new structures, we need new modes of participation, but also we do have existing ones. I mean, if you look at the trade union movement, we look at community unions. I spoke about Acorn in my piece as well. Like, these are large-scale democratic structures looking at redesigning workplaces, redesigning everyday life. There is a question of power there, and maybe it's not a case of new structures, but also actioning in ways in which these existing structures, and obviously our social movements as well, which have always engaged with, you know, political representation, a form of, you know, lobbying, whether it's these, like, trade unions, community unions don't have actionable power, but like, they are ways to channel people, they are ways to channel participation. I think there is a need to embed those in with all decision making, which I think is why citizen assemblies are exciting, but I think they also need to be actionable. We can't just have a talking shop of people. People need to have the power for it to be any meaningful participation.
Great, thank you, Minesh. And Joshua?
I actually think devolution of power, Ruth raised this earlier, is probably the most important thing that could lead to meaningful change. democratic life in Sheffield. I think there is not enough power at a local level for it to matter to a lot of people in the way that it really should. And I think in England in general, there's a concentration of power in Westminster and just not enough power locally. For what it's worth, when people advocate for a Yorkshire Assembly, I feel quite sympathetic. And in fact, it's odd. Maybe it's partially because as a European citizen living in the country, I'm losing all of my representative functions. I don't get the right to vote, and I'm less and less sort of a full member of any kind of political institution in this country than I was before. And in a way, if there was at least some kind of regional assembly, maybe that could be some place in which I would still get to count because I am a resident of the region. But also more generally, I think it's a model that's actually worked quite well. Compared to other countries, devolution in the UK, at least to Northern Ireland, to Scotland, and to Wales, is a symbol of democratic deepening. There's a sense in which in those places, a lot of power feels closer to home for people. I think if we could multiply sites of power feeling close to home, we'd have a chance to really create this dream democratic culture we've been talking about.
Great, thank you, Joshua. And finally, Ruth.
I think one thing I'll mention, and it comes back to the issue of constitutions. I mean, people often bemoan the fact that we don't have a written down constitution. There's one area where we do. Every council has a constitution. Let's make that our constitution. Let's make that the people's constitution and bring that alive. And I think after the referendum, and if we've got the message out, I mean, we know once people are informed, 80 to 90% of people are just that, and they want to see change. And after the referendum, there is an opportunity. We will be rewriting that constitution, and we want that to be inclusive. We don't want to see it as a technical dry document. We want it to be about us. And all these things going forward are going to be dependent on citizens and communities being involved. I mean, the recent proposals by the council to create community assemblies or local area committees, which won't shift any of the power. It's nothing to do with the referendum. It's a bit of a sop, really, or an effort to confuse, perhaps. It won't shift any of the power. The power will still remain with the strong leader. He or she might be able to delegate it out, but can pull it back at any time. It's only by voting for a modern committee system and voting for change, which is the second option on the ballot, that you can start to see some shifts. But I would love to see some of that stuff, participatory stuff, work alongside us really owning our constitution and giving our councillors, all our councillors, the power that we think they should have to do their job for us.
Great. Thank you very much, Ruth. That was great. Thank you, Minesh. Thank you, Joshua. And thank you, Ruth, for joining us, everyone watching both in the webinar and on Facebook or watching this event afterwards. That's it. That's it for tonight. Thank you all for watching. We're going to be holding another event actually looking at democracy in crisis as part of the Festival of Debate. There's also an event held by Sheffield for Democracy looking at the new LAC system, local action committee system that's going to be coming in from Sheffield Council as well. So please do check out the Festival of Debate programme, which is all available on festivalofdebate.com. And please do check out Minesh's article as well, which you can read on nowtheremagazine.com. And obviously the referendum is coming up on the 6th of May. Thank you very much all for joining us, and thank you again to my panel. Cheers, good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.